Welcome everyone and all of our ISM members, our chapter partners, and all of our guests to today's program. This program is hosted by ISM New Jersey. Today our speaker, Tom Cook, who is the founder and managing partner at Blue Tiger International, will be presenting on nearshoring, reducing risk and cost in the global supply chain. This topic has been creating quite a buzz, and so we're glad that everybody is able to join us today. Please be sure to ask your questions or post your comments in the chat or the Q&A box. Also, if you would like to ask your question live, just raise your hand, and as soon as Tom has a break, we will definitely let you speak at that time and you can ask your question live. But make sure you raise your hand so we know that you have a question that you would like to ask. Also, everyone will receive a copy of this recording, the slides, and your CEH. So at this time, I'm going to turn the program over to our speaker, Tom.
Thank you, Kathy, and always appreciate the great job you do at coordinating these events. So for those in the audience that are unfamiliar with myself and my company, Blue Tiger International are global supply chain consultants. We help companies manage all the challenges that they have in their supply chain, particularly relative to those that have an international footprint. And we've been talking with the ISM New Jersey group for a very long time now, and several times a year we present. We try to make it as user-friendly as possible, so at any point in time, if you have a question or a comment or you want to challenge anything that I put onto the table, you're more than welcome to. So just jump in and raise your hand and ask away. The more interactive we make it, the more interesting it will be. So the first question that we answer in this kind of conversation is, why do we even source globally? There are a number of reasons. And the first is that we have to. Starting in the late 1970s, all the way through to current period of time, a lot of U.S. companies have moved a lot of their manufacturing overseas, mainly to impact the manufacturing cost and the acquisition cost of the merchandise. So there are in some industries that we don't even make products. And if you wanted to find a manufacturer in the United States, it would be very difficult and few and far in between. So we have to go outside the United States just for certain product lines and certain types of commodities, as well as certain types of finished products. But more importantly is the issue of cost. Is you have low cost manufacturing all over the world. And we all know that China sticks out as a sore thumb in that regard. They've been tremendously successful over the last 35 years at developing a tremendous manufacturing prowess in so many different verticals. It's unbelievable. And one of the good things about China is that they've been successful more so than any country in the world in moving people from poverty into middle class. And that has both had good impact and negative impact. The negative impact is that the cost of goods from China have slowly risen as their middle class has become more demanding in their compensation and their structures. A lot of companies source global for diversification of their sourcing portfolio. They don't want to be totally dependent here in the United States for a source, or Canada or Mexico or Turkey or wherever it would be. So they look to move their supplier base over a number of countries, which kind of creates what the next slide item, which is a risk management approach to supply chain. And one of the elements that I've seen grow in supply chain over the last maybe 7 or 8 years, and I think personified more since the COVID period, is the concept of risk management in the supply chain, and supply chain executives being forced to evaluate where risk has occurred, where risk is likely to occur, and take proactive steps to mitigate that risk before it impacts the company. So they would be the primary reasons why companies source globally. So nearshoring, as Kathy mentioned in her opening comments, is a hot topic now. We know it not only because we're involved as consultants in this subject matter, but where we do a lot of public speaking all over the country and also in different places around the world. And it's becoming a high demand area for us to address to groups of people involved in manufacturing, supply chain, and business development. So there are 3 issues that have kind of really moved nearshoring along. The first is the impact of COVID. As all of us that went through COVID realized, is that the supply chain was significantly impacted. It became a household word. People living at home all of a sudden now understood all the complexities because it was in the news every day. But the concept of COVID impact really created a observance and a viewing of all the vulnerabilities that companies have faced by having dependence outside the United States for their products. And more specifically, in the next line item is China itself. There are a lot of companies in a lot of areas, such as personal protection equipment, PPE, that realized that they weren't able to get the supply out of China that they had in their regular demand flow, that China controlled also a number of medical and pharma products that we weren't able to get out of China to the same extent that we should have. So these created tremendous vulnerabilities and exposures. And also, I think as an impact of COVID, we found that more and more people who are involved in supply chain management started to look more carefully and under the microscope their landed costs. And we'll look at a model of that in a moment, but the concept of what does it take for us to acquire something from overseas and bring it to point of value here in the United States. And there are costs to all those steps in that process, and looking at those total costs of all those steps is what we mean by landed cost. So near sourcing, when we get kind of formal about this, is this term that we use to describe the business placing some of its operations close to where its products are sold. This is the opposite, of, excuse me. This is the opposite of the longer trend of outsourcing manufacturing operations to developing nations having lower labor costs. So it's kind of a reversal of the trend that has occurred all the way again from the late 70s all the way through to current timeframes. So it's more thought about of bringing manufacturing back to the United States. And the government, some of the statistics talk about the fact that about 6% of manufacturing has come back to the United States. But we use other data elements from different sources, and we place it closer to 3% has actually come back. When you look at the fact that about 4 to 7% a year was leaving the United States, when you cut that number in half, it's a pretty dramatic change. And it's a change that's growing in proportion, meaning that every month more and more companies are bringing manufacturing closer to the United States. Close to the United States might mean Mexico or Canada, the Caribbean, okay? And we have a concept which is called friendshoring, which is kind of a subcategory of near sourcing, which is bringing it to allied countries such as Taiwan, Malaysia, Turkey, South Korea, or Vietnam. Through COVID, a number of companies moved a lot of their manufacturing to Vietnam and to Malaysia because they didn't have the delays that were coming out of China, both on the manufacturing front and also the transportation front. Taiwan also became an excellent option, as did Malaysia and South Korea. We also found, as our sourcing team looked for places to go to, that we found that Turkey had a tremendous manufacturing prowess. And while they didn't generally service the United States, they did service a lot of countries in Europe. So we were able to divert some of their purchasing and their sales going into Europe to the United States. So they have proven to be a country that has tremendous viability for friend sourcing. So whether we near source or we friendshore, the big issue is the dependence that we have on China. And we have to really kind of dissect this issue because there's a tremendous amount of vulnerabilities that were identified through COVID and continue to this point in time. And that is the whole concept of China having certain minerals, certain raw materials that they control the majority of export sales. And they're using that politically and as a weapon in how they're dealing with the United States as well as other Western countries. So there's a direct impact, not only from a political standpoint relative to the United States, but from a commercial standpoint, because it impacts a company's ability to get the particular minerals or raw materials that it requires in its own manufacturing back here in the United States. So this issue of dependence on China is really not to eliminate China as an option, but to reduce the dependence. We also have to consider the politics of this issue, because now Congress, which is controlled by the Republicans, and the Senate, where it's pretty much evenly divided, along with corporate America, and along with major foreign companies that have U.S. interest here in the United States, are seriously considering the concept of near or friendshoring, both as a concern for national and commercial security. So on the national front, obviously all the vulnerabilities that have been identified in certain minerals, as I mentioned, raw materials, and also industrial products, particularly in our defense infrastructure, being held up where we weren't able to finish the completion of a weapon system or some form of ammunition or some form of defense equipment because we weren't able to get the supply required that was coming out of China. So there are various committees now at the congressional level that are looking at this, and the big concern that commercial interests are watching very carefully is whether or not there'll be mandates and legislation that are being considered by Washington to mandate or legislate that a certain percentage of certain types of minerals and certain types of raw materials have to either be sourced back here in the United States or in countries where we have a much more friendlier relationship with. And appreciate that this creates a significant tension to China because we are their largest export market. So when we modify any sense of behavior in terms of our purchasing from China, they become very nervous and upset in that dialogue. So when we look at near sourcing and friendshoring, we have to look at the benefits. One of them is the minimization and the impact of delays and cost increases and the uncertainty, and creating a much more sustainable supply chain. I think all of us involved in supply chain for the last 4 years would clearly ascertain the exposure we all felt with the uncertainty and the fact that we weren't able to make really informed decisions because everything was in such a state of flux. The stability of the transportation infrastructure was in doubt. The cost increases and escalations of price was significantly higher than we ever saw in the history of more modern history of transportation. And the availability, meaning the ability to provide capacity for the demand that was rocketing through COVID, was not met. So the big issue that people in supply chain, and particularly those with demand planning and inventory responsibilities, was trying to manage safety stock. And the concept of lean inventory really dissipated through COVID, and where companies might have a 2 to 5% safety stock ratio in the past, okay, that has now grown to 20 to as much as 50% safety stock levels, which obviously has increased the cost of storage and warehousing and the cost of inventory not being utilized. When we friendshore and nearshore, we also potentially shorten the supply line. 12,000 miles away in Western China to possibly Mexico, which might only be 700 miles from the point of delivery, or Canada, which may only be 300 miles from the point of delivery, or bringing it back to a U.S. state where it's close to where the goods need to be utilized, manufactured, or distributed. Okay, and also provides ease of control. A lot of times, some of the benefits is not necessarily financial, but they're more related to the fact that the control functions, particularly as relates to risk, okay, are in a much greater capacity in a near sourcing or friendshoring capacity. But having said that these benefits exist, we also have to look at what the challenges are. So the first is that change by itself is always difficult. You say to a purchasing manager who has had a successful relationship with various Chinese suppliers for the last 15 years that you want to move that manufacturing supply base to another country, and they think about the issues involved in tooling and re-educating, recontracting, and redeveloping relationships. The amount of work that's required to do that, you obviously have a certain amount of resistance just due to the fact that people are resistant to change from the starting point. The next is trying to find suitable suppliers that can meet the capacity requirements, the quality requirements, the timely requirements, and the costing requirements that you have in a country like China. Again, one of the good things about China is they've been able to produce a very reliable product, a quality product, and do it cost effectively. Then we have to create a financial justification model to generally make the decision of why we want to move something. And like I mentioned earlier, is it may not be totally a financial justification, but when you bring in the risk management benefit, which is the last one of this slide, that might be the overwhelming factor that would move you to a certain degree of near sourcing and also friendshoring. And as I mentioned before, we never suggest eliminating China or eliminating particular countries where you have a high dependency of sourcing. All we're recommending is really to reduce the percentage of dependency and try to have it more balanced out in other countries. So we created a 4-step process in trying to make a decision whether or not a nearshoring or a friendshoring option works. The first part of that is the assessment process of assessing what the requirements are in a particular supply chain, what the needs are, not just currently, but what they're going to be out maybe 5 or 10 years. From that assessment, recommendations are made, and a financial model is created as to what options might exist that could work to the benefit of that supply chain. Then we create an operational model. This is working with purchasing, sales, customer service, and other silos in the company, logistics, inventory management, demand planning, and so forth, and say, if we make these changes, how are they going to affect our operation? And how are they going to impact cost, timeliness, quality, the checklist that we would have in vetting any supplier. And then lastly is implementation, is taking those 3 first steps and now moving it into an implementation mode. And this process generally can take anywhere from 60 to 120 days, depending upon the uniqueness of the supply chain. So one of the focuses that we look at in that assessment process, that first step.
Hey, Tom,
Yes.
Did you want to take a question?
Sure.
Okay, so I got one question. Okay, nearshore product. How about the components supply base?
Well, when you say how about, what's the question? So,
well, this is one of the comments that he put in, and then he wanted to know how much premium are you willing to pay for nearshoring?
well, let's let me put in that to say that nearshoring and friendshoring is not only finished product, but it is also components and raw materials and parts and things that are used in an assembly process. Okay, which the assembly process may be brought back here to the United States or to another country. The issue of premium, I'm going to give you a couple of examples in a moment to answer that more specifically. But what we try to do is justify the decisions that are made first from a financial perspective, and then secondly from a risk management perspective. And we try to create a balance between those two. But I would say that as a general statement, when your costs start to get more than 15 to 20% of what they were previously, I think you're looking at models that are not going to work within most organizations. So if you were looking for a milestone number, I would say probably about 10 to 12% higher costs might be something that could be tolerable, and where you could deal with those additional costs and find other ways to reduce those expenses. And I'll share some of those options with you in a moment.
Okay, thank you. And we did get a comment from Ernie saying that, let me get it back up there. Great summary on nearshoring. So
Great.
I wanted to let you know about that.
Great, thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Ernie.
you. Pat on the back. So for example, and this would answer the question that came in, is that you might have a higher cost for the product because you're moving it to a more expensively sourced country where their labor costs might be more aligned with the United States. But if it's a free trade agreement country, and I'll give you a perfect example, Israel, their employment rates are actually higher than the United States. The hourly wage for professional workers is much higher there than it is here in the United States. But it's a free trade agreement country. So the duty is eliminated on anything that you purchase. So we do move a fair amount of manufacturing, particularly what I would call high tech or high end industrial manufacturing as an option looking to Israel because of that free trade agreement status. So while the acquisition cost might be 5% higher, you might be eliminating a duty rate of 30% coming out of China. A duty rate of 30%, meaning 5% for the original tariff, and then the 301 tariff, which is 25%, is you're paying 30% on the value of the goods. So yeah, you can pay a higher acquisition cost in Israel, but when the duty is eliminated, that provides the huge benefit. And that's why you have to do this assessment stage and this financial model to see where all your costs are in that landed cost model. You can have an example where the cost is higher, but the freight is much less expensive. We're going to talk about Mexico in a moment as a place to do both near and friendshoring. But if you moved a container from China, 40-foot container, all in, the costs are going to be around $2,500. Appreciate the fact that it was as high as $25,000 2 years ago, but today it's come down now to around $2,500. You can move a tractor trailer from Mexico for $1,000. So you're saving $1,500 on each transportation. So while your acquisition cost might have gone up a little bit, possibly the freight savings in freight might provide you some benefit. The cost is higher, but typical delays are eliminated. So the delays coming out of China, which now have been somewhat lessened, but still exist in certain origins, you don't have that same problem when you go to certain other countries around the world, Vietnam being an example, Malaysia, Mexico, Canada are examples. And if you're right back to the United States, you obviously have a much greater degree of control and therefore reduce some of the risks that are involved. And again, there's a balancing between risk evaluation and cost evaluation. We get critics of near sourcing. Generally, when we work with some of the bigger manufacturers where we're dealing with people who've been in manufacturing for a long time, we run into these challenges. The front one is costly production changeovers. And those are the things we build into the model as a short-term expense for a long-term benefit. Tooling development is obviously a cost that you have to cover. Commodity costs, one of the things that's great about China is that they have within their country a tremendous amount of the commodities and the raw materials that they need to manufacture. If you move manufacturing to other places, they might have to import some of those commodities and those materials into that country. Freight pricing stability. Through COVID, this was one of the big issues, that there was no stabilization of pricing. So when you start to move to another country, the question you have to ask is, what's the opportunity to make sure that in that particular trade lane, you're going to have freight stability? And we do look at that, and we do have historical data available to us to look at how pricing has changed over the last 20-year period. And obviously, we have to be paying attention to political and economic changes that are occurring. And as we all know, they happen every day. Okay, we have a summit going on right now in NATO in Europe, where our president is there, and there'll be a lot of things that come out of that that will have both political and economic circumstances that will impact how we manage and make decisions in our supply chain. And one of the things that's a good thing about China is their ability to handle various levels of production, either greater amounts or lower amounts. And sometimes some countries around the world have more difficulty in handling a lower volume competitively, like China can. So these are things that come into play that we have to navigate in order to make things work. Put together this chart, which came out of a presentation that I gave on the West Coast, specifically to an association of manufacturers up in the Northwest. And one of my analysts on the team looked at the tooling costs of what it would cost to put together tooling for a particular type of machine in the automobile industry in China and India. And the average price came out to be $28,000. When we looked at that here in the United States, it was as much as $105,000. Appreciate that this is a capital expense one time and then can be brought out over a number of years. So we look at it that way, that it's an investment for future benefit. Then the offshoring lead time was another thing that we looked at, because obviously people, once they make a decision, want things to happen very quickly. Is in China and India, we found that the average time frame for tooling was around the 7 to 8 week period. In the United States, it took as much as 14 weeks. However, this comparison was done about a year and a half ago on a presentation that we made there. And we've noticed that the time frame in the United States has actually improved pretty dramatically, and it's probably better by about 20% than it was a year and a half ago. And that's mainly because there are more companies involved in tooling and industrial manufacturing now, so there's a lot more activity, and there's more companies involved in providing support in that regard. Having said all that about the challenges, in the last 4 years, we've successfully moved 30 of 32 projects into nearshoring options, meaning that after we did the assessment and we did the financial model, the operational model, and implementation, we were successful 30 of 32 cases in making that happen. So it says to us that this really becomes a very viable option. So the biggest challenges that we had in all those cases, if we summarize it, would be: one was finding a viable alternative source, either in a friend-shoring or a nearshoring circumstance, and establishing the financial justification model was the other issue that we were involved. And tooling sometimes became an issue because proprietary and intellectual property right issues relative to tooling. But there weren't challenges that we weren't able to navigate through creative approaches and creating compromises between all the parties involved. So we brought China into the conversation a lot. So I just wanted to outline some of the issues that US companies and Western companies and governments have with such a great dependence on China. The first is the intellectual property rights issue, which is that there's little protection for intellectual property rights in China. There's only been one successful case, which happens to deal with Michael Jordan's products that were copied in China, where relief was provided. But we have hundreds of other cases in which no relief was provided whatsoever. So the general rule of thumb is that once you start to move manufacturing into China, you have a significant exposure for your intellectual property rights and copycat products coming out. Appreciate the fact that the United States at this point in time and the West has a very strong stance with China. Most of it is rhetoric, fortunately, but it always is concerning because when serious problems occur, it starts with rhetoric. There are specific issues Relative to Taiwan, if you're paying attention to the news, you know that China is threatening to take back Taiwan over. And China is trying to dominate its presence in the South China Sea, which has been really open waters for hundreds of years. And now they're saying that they should be in control of that. And they have a strong naval presence there to demonstrate that prowess. A big concern for all companies involved in any level of manufacturing or buying from China are what we refer to as the forced labor issues. Under the Biden administration, they introduced social compliance as a priority activity of customs. Customs has now seized close to $3 billion worth of products coming out of China into the United States that have been identified that either the supplier or their tier one supplier have provided product that came from a location where forced labor was being utilized in the manufacturing process. We have a case that's pending right now in Los Angeles and Long Beach, where we have a solar panel company that's based in Shanghai, and they imported about $20 million worth of various solar panels and solar panel equipment, and customs seized about 14 containers coming through the port of Los Angeles, Long Beach, on the basis that not the supplier, but their tier one supplier, because in the making of solar panels, they use glass. In the manufacture of glass, they use silicone, and the silicone came from sand pits in the western part of China, where there was a predominance of slave labor being utilized. So the goods were seized. The client was given 14 days to either destroy or re-export the goods. So we moved everything down to a bonded warehouse down in Tijuana until this matter gets sorted out and we can determine whether it actually can be imported or not. If not, then it'll have to be sold elsewhere or brought back to its origin. Other challenges with China is their relationship with North Korea, Russia, their dominance now in a number of African countries, and their alignment with Iran. These are all serious political issues, which will have an overflow relative to commercial issues, and appreciate the fact that the United States is now sanctioning all these countries to death pretty significantly, making it more difficult for commercial interests to sell their products and services in any of these countries. COVID is still a problem in China. They still have outbreaks in various cities. They have a non-tolerance policy. So when an outbreak occurs, they close it down. People are not allowed to move. They're not allowed to leave their homes. People can't go to school. They can't go to their jobs. So it kind of just clamps down very tightly. The military moves in to make sure people honor that requirement. So we still have situations where these outbreaks occur. We obviously don't have that here in the United States to the same extent, and we don't react the same way. And last is forced information transfers. We have a situation that has existed all the time for the 40 years that I've been dealing with China, where they force the U.S. company to provide the technology on how things are done and manufactured, organized, completed, and so forth. And that obviously creates a concern when they use that information for their own benefit. So these are all the issues. So again, I highlight in this area is not to eliminate, but reduce the dependency, take a risk management approach and create options, test the options, because we've been very successful at producing results in most cases. 30 out of 32 is a pretty good watermark. One of the countries that we have some personnel in, we have actually some engineers located, is Mexico, because we move a significant amount of manufacturing into Mexico. It's a low-cost country. They don't have the environmental controls similar to that China doesn't either. And obviously, we have them as an ally. They're part of the USMCA, previously called NAFTA program. So goods that move between the countries, there's no tariff or duties. And obviously the cost of transportation is a lot less. And the cost of managing the relationship is significantly less. Under the Clinton administration, when they put together the US MCA, previously called NAFTA program, they also created a program called the Maquiladora. The Maquiladora allows a Mexican company as a contract manufacturer, or a US company or foreign company that has opened up their own manufacturing or assembly facility in Mexico. They allow them to import raw materials and components and parts from anywhere in the world, including China, and then do that work in Mexico. And when the goods move through the border from that foreign country into a maquiladora assembly location or manufacturing location, there's no obligation to pay duties or taxes. So it comes into Mexico duty or tax free. And then when the finished product moves into the United States or Canada, it moves duty or tax free as well. So the program is proven to be a very successful program at maintaining manufacturing close to the United States. It's also a program relative to immigration, helping to keep more people in Mexico who now can get really good paying jobs at these locations. And just as a point of reference, if you looked at the Fortune 1000 companies in the United States, over 70% of them, of the Fortune 1000 companies in the United States, have a direct or an indirect interest in a maquiladora entity. And that's how relevant it is. And industries such as the automobile industry, home consumer products, such as TV sets and electronics and things like that, are heavily assembled and manufactured at the border points in Mexico, from Tijuana all the way through to Matamoros in Texas. So it really is a very viable option. We have free trade agreements with several countries: Australia, Bahrain, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Israel, Jordan, Korea, Mexico, Morocco, Nicaragua, Oman, Panama, Peru, Singapore, and then the USMCA program with Mexico and Canada and the United States. We've used about 8 or 9 of these countries over the years, and they really proved to be a successful option. As an example, in the Dominican Republic, they have a pretty good textile capability, and we moved a clothing company that was manufacturing in China to the Dominican Republic, specifically to Santo Domingo, suburb of Santo Domingo. And so they have low-cost manufacturing. It's only 2,500 miles from the place and location from the city in the United States to Santo Domingo, as compared to 11,000 miles to the location in China. And when the goods pass through the border, there's no duty or taxes because it's part of the free trade agreement. So it created a very viable option for that company. We've since moved probably about another dozen companies in various areas, of which the people in the Dominican Republic could service successfully. We moved a sporting goods company that actually manufactures baseball gloves and hockey gloves and mitts and things out of leather, because they have that capability to work leather and to sew it into piece goods. Then we found a number of non-free trade agreements over the last 7 or 8 years to also provide some manufacturing prowess. The Philippines, Poland, Brazil, Vietnam, India, Taiwan. And I need to also mention, it's not on here, but Turkey has become a very viable option for us as well in this mix. So these are countries that we've had success in moving them in and creating that financial model that works. And for the most part, all these countries would be considered friends of the United States. So other options. So foreign trade zones is the one that I really want to focus on, because a foreign trade zone can be a manufacturing location, and it could be a distribution or assembly facility. And the best example that I would give to you is that we were involved with helping BMW set up their foreign trade zone in Greer, South Carolina. So appreciate the fact that in the manufacturing process, you import materials, raw materials, components, and parts from around the world. And in their model, the average component and part would come in from overseas at a 6.5%, 7.5%, 8.5% duty rate. Goods out of China would be as much as 30% with the 301 tariffs. You now take those products, they come into the foreign trade zone. There's no duty or tax obligation at the time it comes in because you're moving it into an area that economically sits outside the United States. It gets that special status. And now you complete it and assemble it into a finished automobile. When an automobile enters the United States, the duty rate is 2.5%. Customs allows you to use the duty rate of the raw material component or part or the finished product, whichever gives you the better commercial advantage. So you can appreciate the fact that automobile manufacturer and all the foreign automobile manufacturers now work in foreign trade zones. Toyota and Nissan, even the American ones, Jeep and Chrysler, Ford, GM, all manufacture in foreign trade zones because they import parts and components and basically assemble a finished car in these locations. So foreign trade zones has now become a very significant way for companies to bring back manufacturing or assembly back to the United States and get a significant number of tax advantages and duty relief and customs clearance relief in that process. And it's possibly a webinar that we could do independent at another time for you, because you could talk about how foreign trade zones operate. I could show you various models of how that works as well. The foreign trade zone allows manufacturing, assembly, fulfillment, and distribution. It's deferral of duties. It's elimination of duties. It creates a tariff inversion in the manufacturing assembly process, and it reduces your overall costs of customs clearances and so forth. So it really creates a very strong financial model to make it work. As an example, we worked with a smaller company, $25 million in sales company, tier 2 auto supplier. We switched their facility from, instead of importing finished products, they imported the parts and the components, and they finished the assembly at their USA facility, which we turned into an FTZ. So against $25 million in volume, we were able to save $3.5 million with going through an FTZ against an additional $125,000 of annual costs involved in operating the foreign trade zone. So you can see very carefully how that financial model could provide significant benefit. And it's creating the real good argument for US companies who really want to bring back some of their manufacturing to the United States. The FTZ provides a very viable tool to use to make that happen. One of the things that we recommend for all companies with a global footprint, and particularly if you're going to start to nearshore, is to make sure that you enter into the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. It's a voluntary program where you basically identify to US Customs how your supply chain works. They bring you into the program, and really what you've done is elevated your compliance and security profile with customs, and there are a lot of benefits that you get from that status. And one of them is easier access to some of the programs, because the foreign trade zones, you have to get customs approval on that process. And if you're in that program, it makes it easier. It's not required, but it does make it easier. One of the greater things that I like about CTPAT is they get you a get out of jail free card, so that if you end up having a problem with US Customs in any particular area, it could be a harmonized tariff issue, it could be evaluation, it could be a record keeping issue, it could be a supplier issue, a forced labor issue. You will have already mitigated your circumstances once you enter into that program. So kind of summarizing the thing is, considering nearshoring as a risk management and strategic plan is something I think that everybody in supply chain with a global footprint should be considering. China should be a serious concern for both sourcing and our business development. The big concern really is that politically, we're having obviously a slew of issues. The rhetoric is increasing, the sanctions are increasing. So I don't see in the short term a solution. And so, you know, we walk a very fine, careful line in helping companies in managing their China sourcing relationship or China as a market for their products. And lastly is the point and the argument that I made towards the end, which are foreign trade zones here in the United States are a very viable methodology to use to bring back potentially manufacturing in a nearshoring example back to the United States. And lastly, the Mexican Maquiladora program is also something that can provide significant value and a great option as well. So with that, I appreciate everybody's kind attention. And Kathy, if there are any more questions or comments, I'll be more than happy to address them.
Sure. We did get a comment in about the cost we were talking about earlier. This is from Carolyn. Costs may be overshadowed by the risk of not being able to get the product. So that was one of the comments.
I happen to agree with that. Absolutely 100%. That's why you have to look, when you do the comparison, you have to look at what the costs are and what the risks are, and then make that assessment. And, you know, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that the senior management of every company, whether they're public or private companies, all have various levels of risk tolerance. There are companies that are totally risk adverse, and there are companies that are very open into taking what I'd call informed, calculated risks and so forth. So it's important that people in the supply chain understand at the senior management level what their tolerance for risk is, and then they can bring that into the supply chain from a cultural standpoint in their organization.
Okay, and a question came in. Are there any concerns apart from security for U.S. companies in regards to public policies by the Mexican government? For example, public infrastructure, access to qualified labor?
We haven't had any problems in all the maquiladora and manufacturing options that we've created in Mexico. They don't have any shortage of manpower. Obviously, we know that there's an immigration problem in the United States, and that's because they have people who can't get jobs in Mexico. So when the jobs are made available in Mexico, there are people lined up to get those jobs. The challenge is training them in that particular product and the process. But there are programs that the Mexican government has put in place to make that happen. The security concern is a viable concern and a real concern. I'm down in Mexico often, so I feel it on a personal level as well. But the reality is that you have to use significant level of discretion, and you have to be very careful. And we follow very, very strict protocols when we travel in Mexico. And if you do the things you need to do, then you can reduce any risk involved of any personal harm if you follow certain basic guidelines. I'll give you an example is that, let's say you work for Coca-Cola in Atlanta, and you have a shirt that says Coca-Cola, and you have a tag on your leather valet chest that says Coca-Cola. You don't want to let anybody know that as you go through the system that you work for Coca-Cola. And you don't want to dress in a nice business suit. You want to dress in dungarees and a t-shirt when you travel. You want to keep everything where you're not advertising who you work for. You want to use major airlines and major transportation carriers. You want to stay at higher end quality hotels. You want to prearrange your domestic transportation to and from wherever you're going. If you're working with people down there, they can help you facilitate those things. So it's those types of security protocols. And if you do those things, then you can significantly reduce the risks that involve. In all the years we've been doing this, we've only had some very minimal circumstances where some of our clients have run into some difficulties. But for the most part, if they follow all the protocols, they can be in a pretty safe circumstance.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't actually see any more questions in the chat. So at this point, I'll close out the session for today. I want to thank you, Tom, for presenting all this information. Very outstanding. And everybody's giving you comments here. The great presentation. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Tom. And I hope everybody has a great week. I'll be sending out an email later today, and everybody will get a copy of the recording if they want to review it one more time. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.
Be well. Bye-bye.